Good afternoon, and welcome to my feedback on your Google Hangout 6. I'm doing it out of order because I got the link from Shauna and it worked when I got it. But when I was trying to view it this weekend, that link was inactive. So I do apologize. I have not seen your session on technology and use of virtual communications and virtual EOC. So I do ask if you have time at your convenience this week at some point that you could resend that link, because I think it got broken or something happened. For some reason this semester I had several issues with the YouTube Hangout. I don't know if you encountered the same problems. I've used Google Hangouts on air for quite a while, but since it migrated to YouTube, I've been having problems with it, particularly with the way it posts and streams. So I apologize. I'll try to look for a better platform for future classes. But so I'm going to start with your final one, and I appreciate your discussion on that. And you looked at the issues in mitigation, recovery, response, planning on Deepwater Horizon issue, and started with the discussion started with Shauna looking at planning and mitigation. And so the pre-disaster elements and of two events, really, one being the explosion. I don't think you focused very much on the actual spill. It was more of a focus on transoceanic and on the platform itself and what happened as far as the industry, the private industry, oil industry, as far as safety controls. And so you had a very interesting conversation about organizational culture. And organizational culture will determine a policy and will determine how you make decisions in crisis. And particularly, how you make decisions in response, a lot of times the planning and mitigation is steeped into that organizational culture. And as you mentioned, the organizational culture was dealing with inherent risk and tolerance of risk or acceptance of risks for decades, lack of proper investments, lack of good faith, and poor regulations. So, you mentioned all those. No time and energy dedicated to coordinate and check plans, and that lack of imagination to anticipate this. And this is particularly, it's hard to predict what I think Christine was talking about, those events that have not happened before. They're so complex that when you talked about the Kuhnefin framework, and you talked about the obvious, complicated, and complex. The complex are sometimes so complex that they're called black swan events. That's an actual terminology for those that, no imagination could have predicted that you're going to have, 70 or 80 days of oil gushing and polluting the marine life and the ecosphere in the Gulf. And, the black swans require, different types of responses. But with respect to the explosion, and I think Shauna, put it very nicely, it wasn't something that couldn't be anticipated, because there were certain very basic safety processes that were not observed. There were audits that were clearly being conducted, that Shauna discussed, that there were things identified that needed to be corrected, but no investments were made in order to correct those. Project was over budget and weeks behind schedule. We hear it all the time. And so, for somebody that deals with emergency management and budgets and public officials and politics, those are real concerns. Those are the concerns where what needs to be done. And Christine talked about the frustrations that her husband experiences doing those security audits. And that the companies are cutting corners. They are cutting corners either because they reduce their workforce, oil industry being one of the ones that has been suffering as of late. And so now there is 10 times more responsibility on certain functions. There are certain people that didn't have those responsibilities before, and you have to prioritize. And sometimes those safety concerns that are a little bit more down the road are not as pressing as some things that might be quick fixes that are more doable, that are cheaper. And so the lack of research, and this is, when you look at Deepwater Horizon, you did not discuss in depth the recent research that has emerged from this spill. Karen brought up some of the studies that indicated that the use of Corexit turned out to be possibly 50 times more toxic than actually letting the glob drift in the water and getting broken down by naturally, or be taken away with the currents, versus dispersing it from the surface, which was also a very bad image for BP. And Christine talked about BP and the image and the brand, and there's a very interesting research that you've done on that. But lack of research on environmental impacts of oil catastrophes. Obviously, you will recall, and that might have been in a report, in a congressional report, the Exxon Valdez spill in the late 80s. And some of the lessons out of Exxon Valdez were that they could not determine what were the health effects on the responders in Exxon Valdez. A lot of people died, a lot of people claimed that they developed sicknesses and illnesses, but they did no baselines. So because they didn't do the baseline for the responders, what was their state of health, or, prior to the incident, they couldn't do really good research after. So, of course, one of the lessons learned is that, in the next catastrophe of that type, before you allow people to, respond, you track their health records and things like that. And of course, that didn't happen in Deepwater Horizon either. So research is very difficult when you don't have processes set in place to conduct research. And, research was not a priority after Exxon Valdez came and went. After we cleaned up the pelicans and the seals, and the environmentalists got appeased, and then other priorities took place, and again the research on Corexit particularly was not implemented. So EPA and Coast Guard not being experts, particularly EPA, not being experts in those complex environmental issues or environmental impact issues. It's a lack of experts, lack of research is a big problem, because ultimately, as we are using more daring and more risky technologies, such as drilling at 5,000 feet underwater, then research should keep pace with those type of technological advancements. And the problem there also was with that mineral services and being part of the interior, so governmental entity. I think Christine talked about that. One of you talked about how Mineral Service Office was issuing licenses to the operators, and at the same time that were ensuring compliance on safety procedures, where, first of all, they were overworked, overburdened, under-researched, understaffed, underfinanced as a government entity. They were not up to speed. Their inspectors were not up to speed in research. And then they really didn't have teeth because they had that conflicting role of, you sort of get your income from the licenses at the same time you're supposed to do the enforcement. So it's very interesting that Christine, I think, brought it up, because in Europe, after the big series of events in the 80s that had to do with industrial oil incidents on the waters, there were new laws introduced, and those laws actually use what's called a precautionary principle. So we use precautionary principle with public health emergencies. So if you're looking at, for example, Ebola scare or Ebola gate from a couple years ago, the hospitals were working on the assumptions that, all those symptoms that could possibly have been Ebola before they were verified, they were treating them with abundance of caution. Now, as far as drilling and oil industry, we have very risky behaviors in the United States, and we follow totally different philosophy than the Europeans do, because the Europeans learned from their big events. Piper Alpha spill, if you heard of it, was one of such, really critical catastrophes for the Brits. They had their inquiry and their Piper Alpha report. And so they adopted that precautionary principle, and based on that, what they do actually, they do worst case scenario planning for any operator that wants to do those innovative technologies or drilling and so forth. They have to prove that they do have safety and security plans in place first before they get the license to operate. So we had a reverse process, issued licenses, then set up some standards for safety and security, and then do audits. So the Europeans do it in reverse. First, we are going to look at all the risk assessments. We're going to look at all the plans. We are going to look at all the worst case scenarios and how you attend to those. And then we're going to make a determination if you're going to get a license. Of course, the way we had the government at the time set up, the Mineral Service, got disbanded clearly. But that was definitely an issue. So organizational culture and also the organizational structure, where it fits, is the fox guarding the hens, so to speak. So that was identified as a problem. The effects of Corexit, again, I think that it was Karen that talked about it. Shauna, you talked about federal on-scene coordinator role and how the EPA, finds and sends the bills to and bills the private operator. The problem with Corexit and EPA particularly is that it is a proprietary recipe, and it is patented. So nobody exactly knows the constitution of Corexit. It's supposed to be like soap, but because it is a proprietary product and it's only one producer in the world in Texas that makes it, then of course it's patented. And so you have to work on faith to, and short of a research on effects, because the company did not conduct obviously research on the effects of Corexit. That's again not based on precautionary principle, but it's a different philosophy of running the country and economy that we are doing. Some of the issues that you talked about as far as mitigation. Possible mitigation to, I think, Shauna, you talked about mitigation and education, particularly educational programs about the effects of such, hazardous materials for people that live in the coastal regions where, you're very well aware that drilling is going on and those incidents do happen. So what are the protective mechanisms for people. This is particularly troubling with the Gulf area because, as you know, it was a double whammy. You know, that 2005 was Katrina, and then 2010 was Deepwater Horizon. So the people that were talking about recovery, there were still an economic recovery for the tourism, and you mentioned tourism and the tourist economical impact, and how concerns about tourism and economy also sometimes drive policy. So it was already the region that was very hard hit, and people could not afford to sort of sustain themselves with another event that was lasting for so long. When you talk about 3 months of oil gushing and totally shutting down the operations of, fisheries and crabbing and shrimping in the biggest exporter of this product in the United States. And add to that the socioeconomic layers of people that live in Louisiana that are part of that business. There was very, very, very difficult situation from that standpoint, and people were willing to be first responders because BP created that vessel of opportunity program to where you could participate in a response and cleanup and help burn that stuff on the surface if you had a boat. So if you couldn't do shrimping and suddenly, your area was contaminated, now you could get money from BP to participate in a response through that vessels of opportunity. But people that participated in that, they were participating because of financial reasons, because of economic reasons. They were not having any education about health effects, about hazardous effects, about, the HAZWOPER training that, the first responders get. Some of those people got that training in English and they were not even speaking English. Those are the Vietnamese, population that, came out in some of the reports out of Deepwater Horizon. So some of those things that were being done, like burning that stuff on the surface of the water in itself, is extremely toxic. So the lack of personal protective equipment, not to mention working, in extreme heat and collecting the oil off the sand and the big tar balls of the beaches and trying to clean it up. So there's a huge issue of, education, proper education of volunteers that were of volunteers by actually economical duress. And Karen was talking about, how we should tell those people to have their continuity of operation plans and, continuity of operation planning for everybody, for every little business and entity. But research shows that there are very few small businesses that can actually survive the event that takes them out of business for more than a week. Not to mention a month or 2 months, because they don't have capital, because they don't have so many resources where they can invest in redundancies. So that complicated tremendously the ability of the population to be educated, and then they might have been educated, but they took the risks, because you take the risk if your economic survival depends on it. So again, this weighing of risk, you're looking at two different philosophies. Are you using a precautionary principle? Are you using safety? For first responders, whether they are professional first responders or they are, spontaneous volunteers, as it so happened in unprecedented numbers in Deepwater Horizon. So, of course, so small businesses don't have money for contingencies. You talked about it. Perhaps some public education mostly in respect to the insurance and how to fill out insurance claims and how to apply for small business insurance, and through federal agencies, because for a lot of people this process is really very bureaucratic and very complex, and it takes a long time for them to do it, and in that time it's a tremendous stress on resilience. And that goes back to the issue that Christine talked about, which is the over-reliance on federal and state aid, which has been, noted after 9/11, and with a national response plan and with Katrina, that in 100 years of emergency management, we went from total reliance on local and your own ability to cope, with supplies, with some kind of money saved, with some kind of continuity of operations, with relying on your neighbor, with having strong local networks, to sort of more dispersed type of responsibility and reliance on other forms of aid and reliance on external support, and more declarations of disaster and more involvement from the state and federal government. And people perhaps tend to prepare less or be less attentive to this issue, or not maybe pay heed to them, because they are relying on that external response. And I think that Louisiana had very progressive governors after Katrina. Jindal was very involved with National Incident Management System, and having the Louisiana Emergency State Operating Center, and coordinating with affected jurisdictions. The problem there was, and I don't think you mentioned that, that's something that we discuss in Intel and Information Intelligence course, is that there was an issue of two different plans that were at work. There was NIMS, National Incident Management System, and there was a National Contingency Plan that is very old, that's from the 70s, that deals specifically with marine chemical spills, and how to, that's a total separate national plan, where the Coast Guard is the on-scene incident commander, the EPA comes into unified command, and so on and so forth. So that local state NIMS type of framework, national response framework with safety officers, with having those protocols for ensuring safety, having those priorities, objectives, and all that. That was sort of out of the window, but that was what Louisiana practiced for 5 years since Katrina. And this is what the governors, and this is what the mayors, and this is what emergency management coordinators were practicing. So now you have a totally different structure. You have a different federal plan that is not the national response framework. And the two at the beginning were not joined or aligned. So there was no safety officer function. And that was, a big issue with all those vessels of opportunity and spontaneous volunteers that were credentialed into the event, but nobody ensured the guidelines for safety, because they were working within the national contingency plan. And that's a big issue of the interoperability of those plans. They were not interoperable. And we are talking about all hazard, but truly it was all hazards, but the marine chemical spill, because there's something else for it. So, political dissonance was really big. President Obama came during the Deepwater Horizon and had a very tenuous and very difficult conversations with the mayors and emergency management officials that were working that area, the Gulf area. I think that Christine did a good job on the research on BP, and talked about how BP has this really great, it is a very interesting picture that you painted of the BP being, it actually changed its name from British Petroleum, where petroleum is dirty, to BP with that nice symbol of green and white. And you mentioned that it was very interesting, because it really paints a picture how the corporation with such a bad safety record. And you talked about 1965, 13 people killed, Texas City disaster, and of course another spill in 2006, cited for safety violations in 91, 2001, 2005, ranked amongst the worst polluters And that brings me again back to that precautionary principle that Europe is operating on, which we don't have the same philosophy on that. Huge money on lobbying, so of course more money spent on lobbying than on safety precautions, and no prevention systems in place chronically. So that goes back to that organizational culture of complacency. And truly no commitment to preparedness and safety, no contingency plans. And then we had a conversation on the minerals management service that I already touched upon. This was a sort of very ineffective bureaucratic governmental structure that did not support proper audits or proper enforcement because they had no teeth, and really they had no technical expertise. So it's very hard to enforce something when the people in the private sector, BP representatives have better expertise than the inspector. So leadership, lack of timely decisions, no training, no planning. Shona raised some very concerning issues about the rig never sleeping, operating 24/7, and what is the continuity of operation planning for entities or organizations like that. And you cannot shut down some systems, because if they are operating all the time, you lose a lot of money economically if you have to postpone certain operations. Just imagine the Port of Houston, one of the largest ports in the nation, with that much money and cargo and stuff like that. If they're out of business for one day, that's millions of dollars, if they have to attend to some major security issues. So you're talking about, somebody mentioned Pemex, which I believe is a chemical corporation out of Mexico, and about them polluting in our waters. It appears how Europe, and particularly in the Baltic area, which is an ecological zone, there are Helsinki agreements, protection agreements, as far as exploration, oil extraction and exploration in that area. So everybody is sort of moving to our coast that lacks those basic processes in place. Like with any critical event and complacency, Shauna, I think you used this, maybe it was Christine, you used the expression that it was not, with those entities working like that, being overexploited, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, where vulnerability is really high. This is a very high risk industry to start with. This is not, producing advertisements or Hollywood making movies. This is a high risk industry, and people that work in that industry already, starting with a high risk. And if you don't have mitigation in place and those safety precautions, then the consequences are catastrophic, as it was the case in Deepwater Horizon. And then I think that, and all that they can do, like you said, is they can triage when something happens. A really interesting part of your discussion that you had was Christine, who decided to tackle the Cynefin. Or Cynefin, call it whatever you want. It is a complex model. And I really like your exploration process, because, I particularly like the statement that you have actually learned to sort it out as you had to explain it, which is, I really like that process of you presenting the information, because, that's the best way to learn, to try to figure it out. And I really like the way you presented it. You looked at those different types of events and how different decisions are going to be made differently depending on what type of complexity in the event you have. And so from obvious to where you can rely, you know that you can distinguish patterns. You have standard operating procedures, you have checklists or templates, and you do pattern matching, and you have expectations that if this happens, that's probably going to happen too, and you base that on lessons learned, and you base it mostly, the obvious events that you're going to have are the cyclical ones that happen in a particular industry. And they happen quite often, the flooding in Texas, or the earthquakes in California, or the, tropical issues in Florida. So you're able to, in those obvious events, if you have expertise, if you have people that are competent, in decision making, they're going to know those lessons learned. They're going to know those patterns of response. They're going to know standard operating procedures, and they can match their knowledge with what's the next step. And then you gather more information. You can identify the next step. Then you move into the which one was it? Complicated. The complicated. This is where you have a situation that is based again on maybe not so obvious, but there are good practices, there are general practices to guide you through those initial decisions, and then you know what kind of questions you want to pose. You might not know the answers, you might not know how to resolve a certain problem, but you know where you stand, so you know the question to ask. You know what kind of assumptions you might have about the situation, and you want to make sure whether they are correct or not correct. So at least you are in the starting point that you know what you don't know, sort of, in a complicated situation. You know what you don't know, so you're trying to find out the answer to that. And you have to then access the right experts that know. You can devise accurate plans, and it's an evolutionary process on relying on experts to solve the problem, and the experts would have dealt with those problems. So going from obvious, where it's more of a routine decision making, to complicated, where you actually can identify areas you don't know, then you find somebody that does, and they help you on those specific steps. And then you go into what I call is those black swan events, or complex, unknown unknowns. So you really don't know what you don't know, right? And Deepwater Horizon was definitely that type of black swan event. And so you're not truly sure what questions to ask. So you start asking, whatever questions you can, and trying to carry out some mental simulations to sort of match whether you have a solution. And based on the outcome of the first experimentation, you can only move to the next step then. If it doesn't work, you move to plan B and plan C, and you're trying to look at determining, it's a lot of experimentation. It's basically a lot of simulation, mental simulation and experimentation. And I think that what happens is the very dangerous zone is obvious events are obvious. And I think Christine explained it very nicely, is when you go into the chaos, because you do not know, you take the complex or complicated. So you think that you might know the solution, the question to ask, but they're really not the right questions to ask, because you don't know that you're actually in a complex event. So that brings back, this whole discussion on leadership and situational awareness, and complex events, and escalating and progressing complex events, where, if you don't get a hold of the situational awareness from the get-go, you're not going to know where you are. And you can't sort out anything if you don't know the context, if you don't know, what you don't know, so to speak. So those complex events are the ones that really truly require good incident command leadership. And I think in Deepwater Horizon, what Christine indicated is that the leaders, or the initial command, took for complicated, profoundly complex events that are so interconnected, where there is maybe not a really good solution to anything, and you have to sort of prioritize. So that brought us back to looking at catastrophic risks and looking at worst case scenarios and probing, sensing, and coming up with responses. And Karen discussed the fact that they had opportunities to improve their safety, that they took too long in initial decisions, and then it was not really clear why they used the dispersant. It wasn't based on any particular research. The options were not being weighed. It was sort of like throw everything into it that you can. So they were doing different strategies. And that perhaps, is something that at some point, I think, Kevin Costner suggested dropping, millions of tons of popcorn from the airplane to absorb the oil, or, that there were some creative solutions being considered. So what happened with that decision making is that 5 years later, the research is coming out that not that we're going to have very reliable research again, because a lot of baseline is not present. But looking at respiratory issues, looking at all those problems that came out of Exxon Valdez. So we are 30 years later, and there's no lessons learned. It's sort of this lessons repeated. And again, there was some push in 2015, 5 years after Deepwater Horizon. There was some push to, there's a bill implemented to eliminate Corexit from the inventory of dealing with chemical spills, that particular dispersant. And that has gone nowhere, but it got some momentum. In order to implement policy, there has to be a convergence of three different strengths. There has to be a political will. And political will usually is forced, the hand of a bureaucracy is usually forced by public outcry. And the public outcry is usually forced by the media exposure. And then to that comes research. So when all those align, so you have outcry, media, and research, those three come together, then there is a political will to change policy. And it seemed like, 2015 was this kind of pivotal year where we would see some changes with EPA regulations and Corexit, and because the research came out of universities in Florida on toxicity. And there was, some of that, of those shows that you watched, and health issues along the Gulf Coast, and those responders, and some of those were being highlighted in the media. A lot of environmental groups that were signing petitions, and we sort of, I think, are back to the new normal. So you discussed some of the improvements, building of the Emergency Operations Center for the BP in Houston to, beef up their image on emergency operator. You talked about the brand and how once the brand is lost, it's very hard to get it back. And certainly I think there is a consensus that BP does not have a good brand and probably will never regain that brand, of a clean, nice, white and green, environmentally friendly corporation. Long-term recovery and the effects unknown at this time. Probably years, probably, a lot of research would be needed to study after effects, ecological impact on the mangroves and fisheries and the food supply. As far as restoration of lifelines, the cleanup was quick because of the tourism. And if you go to Louisiana today, it's tourism is back, and the businesses are have reopened, and the seafood industry is thriving again. Um, but what we eat out of Louisiana, we'll never know. Stigma definitely on oil industry. Shona mentioned the North Dakota issue and the pipelines, and the entire debacle with that, which is also definitely political as of late. So I think that's very interesting to look at emergency management and politics. To what degree the politics really impact what emergency managers can do, even if they know the risk, even if they know that their safety precautions are not being taken. Not only they fight with some organizational cultures that are resistant to planning and preparedness and having that mental framework, but they also fighting with a lot of political pressures and priorities and lobbyists and regulators. And of course, a lot of those things are not publicized, and but they do. The political pressures are definitely a big factor in that. So recapping all that, with this particular event, you had severe safety, basic safety procedures, redundancies. The people that were supposed to be able to be educated how to switch the switch, and yet they don't have the authority to do that. So the redundancy of operations planning, continuity of operation planning, some of the leadership issues also with coordination. When that nobody mentioned that, I thought that was one of the really awful things that happened, that it took so long to take the survivors up to the port, and they were being investigated, although they just went through a very traumatic experience. That brings us back to psychological impacts, that we haven't really discussed psychological impacts of that disaster. We talked about environmental, we talked about technological, we talked about lives lost, we talked about recovery in the long run of the ecosystem, or potentially changes in policy, health effect. But there's also that long-term psychological effects on the population. And as far as obviously mitigation, when you're in such a risky business, your mitigation planning is really critical. So if you have or preparedness, if your emergency operation plans or templates borrowed from another agency that operates in different waters and different marine life, and so on and so forth. But this is very common. I think Shauna mentioned that you use templates for emergency operation plans, and templates are great. But that's a problem with using templates too, is where the agencies are too complacent to look at their own specifics of operations, of their own essential missions, and at their context, and there's a huge embarrassment to Halliburton and BP on their emergency operation plans and resources that they listed that didn't exist, because they used them from some other templates. So, and then of course, for us is watching those events down the road, because everybody forgot about Deepwater Horizon. You mentioned a movie. I haven't seen the movie. I'm looking forward to seeing it. That's on my bucket list for summer watching. But and unfortunately, there is some kind of public interest that got sparked by or ignited by introducing the movie. But that will sort of fall off, and the people in those areas are sort of left to their own dealing with the cleanup and the long-term impacts, and we've moved on to the next event. So that recovery part, it would be interesting over the years to look at some events many years ago, and what kind of research came out of that. Just like with Exxon Valdez, or a big oil spill that was at the coast of Mexico in the 90s, that American Coast Guard was helping with as well, that affected the Texas coast. So Exotech, I think, was the name of the disaster. So, or, if you, Christine, if you want to do more research, look at the Piper Alpha. That was the British tanker that went down, and some of the lessons learned in groupthink, in decision making, definitely in Piper Alpha. Some really interesting stuff looking at those long term, long term after. Have we learned anything? So with that, I am going to congratulate you on your last Hangout. I'm still looking forward to seeing your number 5, and I hope that either Shona or one of you will send me the link, and I promise as soon as I get it, I'll watch it so it doesn't deactivate. I'm looking forward to your continuity of operation plan, final reports, and to your final blog. And till the next time I see you in a virtual space. Have a good week.